Good afternoon, everyone. We are coming to you live from Fairsted, the home of Frederick Law Olmsted and the Olmsted firm in Brookline, Massachusetts. I'm Dee Dee Petri, President and CEO of the Olmsted Network, and I welcome you as we celebrate Olmsted's 202nd birthday. I hope you enjoyed the medley of old and new photos as we began this program. And a big shout out to the watch party at Bach Tower in Florida, which is tuning into the program today. These are busy times in Olmsted land. Please visit our olmsted.org website to stay up to date on all of the efforts underway. Be sure to check out our calendar and blog and explore our Olmsted Action advocacy page to see just a few of our ongoing efforts to protect and preserve Olmsted landscapes in Boulder, Milwaukee, Boston, and Washington, D.C. We're especially active right here in Boston, where the integrity of Olmsted's great rural park, Franklin Park, is threatened by misguided and fast-track development proposals. In too many places, city and state leaders believe that park space is empty space. We know otherwise, and we invite you to partner with us as we work to sustain Olmsted places around the country. I hope you will also join us for some exciting trips and conferences later this year. In June, the Olmsted Network will visit Dunn Gardens in Seattle, and in July, go to the Olmsted Beale Farmhouse on Staten Island, where Olmsted incubated so many of his design ideas. We'll be boarding the Staten Island ferry with our 7-foot mascot, Big Head Fred. You won't want to miss it. In September, we'll be headed to Newburgh and Poughkeepsie, where we will host our annual conference, Landscapes of Renewal, Olmsted, Vaux, and Downing. For a small group of lucky people, we're offering a tour of Matthew Benson's Stonegate Farm and Frederick Church's Olana on Friday, September 13, with cocktails on the Olana Piazza. On September 14 and 15, our conference will include an array of great panels, tours of Downing Park and Vassar, and a dinner cruise on the Hudson. Registration will open next month. Today, it's our pleasure to explore the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site, which in so many ways gave birth to the profession of landscape architecture. We will share its preservation story and learn more about its current life as part of the Park Service. Thanks to the efforts of the Olmsted Network and others, the National Park Service acquired Fairsted in 1979. Today, the National Park Service is responsible for preserving and providing access to the landscape, home, office, and more than 1 million papers left behind. We are honored to be working with them on the continued digitization of these important records. And we host a website, olmstedonline.org, which offers a digital portal for plans, drawings, pictures, and more about the many Olmsted firm commissions. Now let's turn to our outstanding speakers, starting with moderator Jay Newman. Jay is not only superintendent of the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site, but also the John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site and the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. Before coming to Boston, he oversaw another Olmsted project, the George Washington Parkway, and served as park planner at the Statue of Liberty National Monument and Ellis Island Immigration Museum. Joining Jay are Turkaya Lowe, Rolf Diamant, and Lauren Meyer. Dr. Lowe is the principal historian of the National Park Service and Deputy Federal Preservation Officer. She is a graduate of Howard University and received her MA and PhD degrees from the University of Washington, Seattle. Before assuming this position in 2017, she oversaw the region-wide history and cultural anthropology programs for 67 national parks. Rolf is no stranger to this program. He is the former superintendent of the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site and currently adjunct associate professor at the University of Vermont. During his work with the NPS, he expanded its conservation portfolio to include wild and scenic rivers, urban parks, and national heritage areas. He is co-author of a fantastic book, Olmsted and Yosemite. Lauren Meyer is also no stranger. She is a landscape architect with a specialty in historic preservation. Lauren has worked on many projects, including restoration of the Fairsted landscape. She is co-author of the historic resource study, The Olmsteds and the National Park Service, and is an editor of the Master List of Design Projects of the Olmsted Firm and the final 2 volumes of the Papers of Frederick Law Olmsted, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. If you look closely, you can see the books behind her. You can treat yourself to the Master List today by going to our website and clicking the link. As is our custom, we'll hear from the panelists for about 40 minutes and then hear from you. Please let us know where you're from in the chat box, but submit any questions you have through the Q&A. With that, let me turn this over to Jay. Welcome, Jay, to our happy birthday celebration for Mr. Olmsted.
Thank you, Dee Dee. And Olmsted looks good for 202. So I want to thank Dee Dee, and I want to thank the panel today and everybody on the line. And I know that Bach Tower's out there, so thanks for joining in with the big group. In 1971, Artemis Richardson, the last partner of Olmsted Associates, wrote to the National Park Service to gauge interest in preserving the Olmsted home and office in Brookline, Massachusetts. While sending his note up the chain, then Regional Director George A. Palmer noted that the property was considered by many to be the tangible site and a link to the beginning of both landscape architecture and formal planning in this country. If the house and its contents merit action, the Olmsted story might become a special feature of the centennial year. We in the National Park Service are extremely fortunate to serve as stewards of Fairsted. Our stewardship comes in the caring of cultural landscape and historic structures, preserving and providing access to the Olmsted Archives, and ensuring public access and education through programming and outreach. We feel a very special connection to the site and those thousands of cherished places across the country that were conceived here amidst this home, office, and landscape. I've gravitated to the saying since coming on board, this is a place of places. No matter what brings people to our site, almost everyone finds a connection to a place they know, use, and love. So it's a great honor to be here today with the panel, and let's get to it. So I'll start with the first question to Dr. Lowe. We know that the addition of the new NPS sites frequently reflects the cultural context of the time. Yeah. In 1970, the 1972 National Park Plan, also referred to as the NPS Thematic Plan, represented a significant broadening of the NPS mission. Can you speak to how the NPS approached new sites in the late 1970s and 1980s, and how this site fit into the calculation broadening the NPS mission?
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, good morning to those of you who are in a farther time zone. Thank you so much for having me as part of this discussion for the 202nd birthday commemoration of Olmsted. Well, as a historian, we have to back up to before the 1972 plan. How did we get to the 1972 plan? So we really have to think about the National Park Service at 50 years of age, right? We are in the 1960s. We are responding as a country to fundamental changes in our electorate with the civil rights movement, women's movement that is occurring, that's shifting political power, demands for increased expansion of recognition of themes in American history and the historic sites and places that are important to that history. We're not only expanding our views of what's significant in American history during the 1960s, we're also starting to think about, hey, we want to form recreational parks, right? We have this category of historical parks and natural parks, but Congress then added to the mission of the Park Service to start to shepherd recreational areas that are more in this urban landscape, right? And that's part of the landscape and the philosophy of Olmsted and his firm, that there should be these urban spaces that are open to all, egalitarian, that relieve some of the pressure. So already the National Park Service had started to position itself to this expanded role in public lands and public spaces. And it was in the late 1960s that the Secretary of the Interior, both Udall and Hickel, made it a mandate for the National Park Service as an agency to survey our existing sites, to perform a gap assessment, and to expand the things that we deem to be significant in American history, and to use this gap assessment as a tool for adding new units to the national park system. And that is what the 1972 National Park System Plan is. It's a mandate for the National Park Service to round out the system, to expand the types of parks that we steward for the benefit of the nation, to expand our representation of the types of parks for the types of important parts of American culture, American history, our natural resources that should be preserved and protected. In terms of the designation of Olmsted, two of the most prominent themes of the 72 document was America at Work, looking at labor, occupational groups, of which architecture and city planning, Olmsted and his firm, and as progenitors of the occupation, the profession itself, and the practice of city planning, right, in American history are formed from America at Work. The second theme was society and social conscience. And I'm not sure, you did the quote earlier about the regional director saying that the Olmsted site may be illustrative of architecture, landscape architecture of city planning. I don't know at that time if they would have placed him in this theme of society and social conscience. But we know Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and Jr. were convinced that the concept of democracy could be demonstrated by having these egalitarian public spaces that were regenerative for well-being, both individually but as a society. And so I think the park unit, its designation in 79, is a firm reflection of the 1972 expansion, which begins in the 1960s.
So how did the inclusion of not only the Olmsted site, but many other sites based in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, how did that change the composition of the service's cultural resource program? Did it have an impact on the cultural resource program?
It did. It did. The increasing number of parks that were historical in nature, 3/4 of the national parks are historical parks, whereby cultural resources are the major components of why that site was designated. This increased the National Park Service need for resource stewardship, right? To make management decisions to preserve and protect those cultural resources, not only the site of Fairsted, but also the archives, the collections that are held by the park for the benefit of the nation, right? And so it provides, by designating these increased numbers of cultural resources parks, it actually encoded even more the National Park Service mission to preserve and protect into perpetuity, right, for future generations. And you can see a lot of our policy development within the National Park Service in terms of Secretary of the Interior standards for repair, rehab, professionalization of cultural resource management, disciplines. The increase in the number of parks caused this to be a need. And I think the Olmsted site is very much a powerful example by the inclusion of the archives of the Olmsted firm of National Park Service expanded role in cultural resources management, management of ephemera, being even a research center, right? For those that are interested in landscape architecture and city planning.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. It's interesting, you mentioned 3/4 of the national park system are historical sites, historical parks. So many people think about the Grand Canyons, they think about the Yosemites, but the vast majority are these smaller cultural sites. So Rolf, to you, initially there was a division within the NPS over Fairsted's eligibility as an NPS unit. Can you describe Dr. Ernest Connolly's early vision of Fairsted as a new kind of historic site? And how was that vision eventually realized? And what was the impact of the larger NPS? And then for folks on the line, Dr. Ernest Connolly was the first director of the National Park Service's Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation.
Yeah, he was a senior official in the hierarchy in Washington. I think it's important just for everyone to realize that it's never a linear path, that Dr. Lowe's very clear record of progress, but it was a difficult transition, and not everybody came on board at once. Actually, your predecessor, Dr. Lowe, one of your many predecessors, looked at Fairsted when given the proposal to create a park. They looked at it through a lens of a traditional house museum. In fact, from their perspective, if you didn't have Olmsted's original pipe and slippers, you really didn't have a park. And of course, you didn't have that stuff. What you had was this remarkable office and this expansive collection. But they didn't, the collection was largely invisible initially to some people. And even when they came around to agreeing that there was significance and importance of including the park in the system, there was still this reluctance to recognize the collection. And they assumed that the collection would be cared for and paid for by somebody else, that there would be a new party that would step in. And they thought for many years it was Harvard University was going to step in and do the work for the National Park Service. And we were going to do what we were used to doing: interpretation, restoration of buildings. These were the things that came easily to the Park Service. The expansion that Dr. Lowe was referring to, this sort of maturation of cultural resources, was still a work in progress. Now, Dr. Connolly was a voice of dissent. And from the very beginning, he made it very clear that this was never going to be a traditional historic house museum, that this had the potential to be something very different. It could certainly interpret Olmsted, but it would interpret it in the context of the impact on the nation. And to do that, they had to focus on the collection. And he envisioned that this site eventually one day would become a national study center for the preservation of American landscape. That was a very prescient vision in the 1970s. But clearly he saw the potential that a lot of other people didn't see, and made his views well known.
Thanks, Rob. In bringing online a place like this, an important aspect would be grassroots or advocacy. Can you share with us the advocacy efforts behind adding Fairsted to the NPS? And then what convinced NPS and ultimately U.S. Congress to add the Olmsted National Historic Site to the system?
Well, that was a battle. And, in effect, it required champions. And it required individual champions who were going to advocate for the site. And there were people in ASLA, and I'm thinking also William Alec, who was a historical architect, who were just stuck to it. It also required support in Congress. And the Office of Senator Edward Kennedy sponsored the legislation. And, you know, unheralded is the work of his staff over a decade to keep this alive and moving forward. But ultimately, even the National Park Service, when they sensed that where the tide was going, got on board. And but even with everything going for it, with advocacy, and this was a national constituency, with the support of champions, important senators and congressmen, it still took almost a decade from the time the original legislation was introduced to the actual designation of the National Historic Site. So it was a long struggle. The archives was also, a battle. When the National Park Service took over Fairsted, they knew what they were good at, and they went to it, and bless them for it. And they understood that you had this enormous collection and needed storage, and they could renovate storage, but they basically couldn't deal with the collection initially. It was just a bridge too far. And for many years, the collection languished, much to the consternation and frustration of researchers across the country who were banging on the doors, literally banging on the doors, wanting to get in. And, the Park Service was doing projects and spending money, but the collection was basically inert. It just wasn't being addressed. Of course, it was a monumental project, undertaking. When I arrived at Fairsted in the late 80s, there were advocates, and I'm thinking of people like Arlene Levy and Betsy Sher-Gross, who were essentially camped outside my door when I arrived. Just got to do something. They weren't going to be satisfied and needed action on this. This was a huge undertaking, but we were able to marshal that energy and actually get a hearing in Congress on the state of the archives. There was, a congressman, chair of the House Appropriations Committee, who took Sidney Yates from Chicago. He had Olmsted landscapes in his district. He was interested. He wanted to know why the National Park Service wasn't acting on the cataloging and conservation of this collection. And Yates had a hearing. The director of the Park Service attended, and Director Mott, and he asked Mott, we're going to give you money for this. And Mott said, oh, well, we give us money, but let us make the decision on where to spend this. We know best. And there are a lot of other collections in the National Park Service, and maybe we should, make the decision who has priority. And, Congress said, no, 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 no. This is what we want. And to make sure we're going to get what we want, we're going to earmark that money. And it came to the Olmsted National Historic Site as an earmarked operating base increase, which is reasonably rare. Today, it's completely disappeared. But there was also the regional curator, a gentleman named John Myonis, who was a real champion as well. And he brought all sorts of other funding to the site. And all of a sudden, the park went from 0 to 60.
So Ralph, it's a very interesting story, and you receive money, and now that money has got to go to the site, to the collection. So how do you take that money and drive it into making the collection accessible, and how do you make those documents not only accessible internally but externally? And you had challenges related to that, and what were those challenges, and how did you overcome them?
Well, I use the analogy, Jay, of of owning a sailboat and sailing it and painting it at the same time. You needed to do both. And the real challenge, what you needed is you needed money and you needed space. Two things you really needed. to do this job. We got the money, but then the issue was space, because you couldn't renovate the storage at the same time you were doing conservation and on the collection and opening it up to researchers all at once, all in the same space. Couldn't do it. And that's the advantage of the National Park Service. It's a system. You're not a one-off. You're not by yourself. And bless their hearts, Springfield Armory, National Historic Site in Western Massachusetts, said, well, we have thousands of feet of unused space. And we'd be glad, you know, if you buy us a few bagels at the end of the year, we'll be glad to make it available to you. And, you know, and so out in Springfield, we set up a paper conservation lab. We set up storage, and the park also opened up a research space for incoming researchers. And meanwhile, back at Fairsted, the work went on renovating and expanding storage in the vault. So that was, Jay, that was painting and sailing the boat at the same time.
Thanks, Ralph. So Dr. Lowe, while the NPS has sites with robust archival collections, Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site differentiates itself with a collection that is not only actively used for scholarship, but for preservation and maintenance of green spaces around the nation, including places in the NPS.
Right.
How would you describe the impact of our collection on contemporary resource management and land stewardship?
Well, for historians like me, federal historians, we are with a preservation and a conservation mission. We are looking for the information in the archives to support our management decisions, right? How do we maintain these resources to their historic appearance? How do we maintain their condition? To understand what the original design and philosophy of the site is or was planned to be, so that we can make decisions in the present about how to restore or maintain those landscapes. So this is our primary source material, right? To make those decisions about our stewardship. What the plantings were like, what were the spatial relationships, what feelings should our architecture, our landscapes evoke in the settings, and also what type of proposals would we make for further expansion of preservation of some of our national parks, right? The landscape may be one that we don't have ownership maybe of those vistas or those scenic areas that are very important to maintaining the presence of one of our national parks. So we definitely need this primary material to understand and carry out our mission of preserving and conserving the space. And without these archives, we are speculating to a certain extent. And although we do that and have done that in the past, we want to be historically accurate in order to maintain these important landscapes. And it would be the same for those Olmsted projects that are at the city and state level, international level. How do we care for these landscapes? And this archive gives us that surety that how we're moving forward in integrity with our management decisions.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. I know there's a lot of folks on the line that are shaking their head. They're in agreement with you. So, Lauren, you were part of the team that undertook the cultural landscape report for Fairsted. How did you utilize the archives in the restoration work, and how did the team balance the importance of both the natural and cultural aspects of the site?
Sorry. Thanks, Jay. And I'd like to really follow up on what Turkai just said, which is that we could not do what we do to be responsible stewards of historic and cultural landscapes without archives such as the archives at Fairsted. And that is completely true for the restoration of the grounds here, which was part of a multi-phased cultural landscape report and implementation that included a site history, documentation of existing conditions, analysis of integrity and significance, a treatment plan following the Secretary of Interior standards, and the implementation of that treatment plan, and then of course follow-up preservation maintenance. We had a big team. It was a wonderful collaboration of folks from both the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site and the Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation, which formed at a really critical time as a joint project between the Cultural Landscape Program in the regional office and the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site. The team included Cynthia Zajewski as our site historian, and the Arnold Arboretum, who we collaborated with in terms of identifying and propagating historic plant material. But Cynthia was able to look at every single available piece of primary source material. Much of that, of course, is in the archives at Fairsted, included massive amounts of photographs and plans, planting order lists, which we found to be particularly helpful because the firm documented, what they ordered, what arrived. We knew what was subsequently planted on the site. And I think we're able to, at the end of the day, implement a fully accurate restoration of the Fairsted grounds that depicts its appearance in around 1930 at the height of the Olmsted brothers' activity on site, which of course includes a massive office wing addition, but with part of the site really retaining integrity from the time that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. was in residence. And at the end of the day, the Fairsted landscape for me serves as an amazing three-dimensional representation of, the Olmsted design principles in practice. And it's really a unique place where you can see where the design was created, in 2 dimensions, and then experience it in 3.
Thank you, Lauren. Anybody else want to weigh in? Leave it a little open for the archival, or, Ralph, did you have any thoughts? Any other thoughts you wanted to weigh in on related to the archives? Otherwise, we can move forward.
The only thing I would add, I just would emphasize what Lauren said about a collaboration and all hands on deck. And Lauren was wearing multiple hats, but she was working for the Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation, which I think should be looked back as even though the center is no longer physically located at Fairsted, Fairsted should be very proud of its paternity for the Olmsted Center, which goes on today and does work all over the national park system.
Yep, with sort of a critical mass coming together between the work that was being done at Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site and the work that the head of the Regional Landscape Program, Nora Mitchell, was doing. And it was really an exciting time to be involved in landscape preservation, the National Park Service. The one last note, though, Jay, I'd like to mention, of course, is the importance of the Olmsted Archives at the Library of Congress, because in fact, part of the collection did get sent to the Library of Congress. And that collection is incredibly important to the Olmsted story. In the case of Fairsted, not so much, because ironically, the fact that they were there at Fairsted, there isn't much correspondence, if any. There are a couple of pieces that are kind of interesting, but by and large, we rely on, for that project, on plans, photographs, and other records.
So Trish, transitioning on from the archives, some of that history and accessibility, and looking a little bit forward to our recent centennial in 2016. The centennial of the Park Service was in 2016 and prompted a deeper look at the Olmsteds as conservationists as well as landscape architects. In 2020, Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site sponsored a historic resource study that explored the role of the Olmsteds in the creation of the NPS. So Lauren and Ralph, as two authors of the study, why is understanding this broader interpretation of the Olmsted role in the origin of the National Park Service important to the layered history of America?
Well, I'll just start by just thanking you, Jay, and the staff of the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site, and Ethan Carr, who was our third collaborator on this, for the foresight to undertake this project. That there hadn't been this kind of thorough documentation of the Olmsted's contribution specifically to the national park system over a period of almost a century, and to the creation of the national of the idea of national parks. If not the creation, certainly a major contribution to thinking about national parks, and specifically referring to the Yosemite Report of 1864 and 1865. Lauren handled all the work on Olmsted Jr. and his contribution in adding the key language to the 1916 Act creating the National Park Service, the Organic Act. But that was largely based, we made the argument, it was largely based on work that his father had pioneered at Yosemite almost 50 years earlier. And Ethan and I tiered off of the bigger study to do our book, Olmsted in Yosemite, Civil War, Abolition and the National Park Idea, that was published by the Library of American Landscape History, from that larger study. And I think Dr. Lowe certainly would agree that this is something the National Park Service likes to see, which see its research study in print for a larger public. And all the credit goes back to you, Jay, and the staff at Fairsted for giving us this opportunity. But Lauren, you really did the lion's share of this. I mean, because it was a prodigious record of the Olmsted firm and the National Park Service that you researched. You should talk about that.
Well, thanks, Rolf, for that, and also thanks to the Olmsted National Historic Site for thinking about this and giving us the opportunity to really do a dive into the work that the Olmsteds have done over many years related to the national parks. I do feel sometimes like we just scratched the surface, and I'd love to see someone do a PhD dissertation on Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and the national park system. But what I can say is that I had the opportunity to look at a broad spectrum of projects, mostly by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., but also including many other members of the firm, particularly Henry Hubbard, that addressed sort of what I would call informal consultations, Olmsted in an advisory role. There were design projects done by the firm. It's really quite interesting. And at the end, I was just really kind of amazed at the energy of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and his travels, particularly in the West, and his ability to really handle sort of big picture issues and ideas and convey them to national park, senior national park leaders. And, it's interesting, he served as an advisor to 6 National Park Service directors over a period of about 40 years, which is pretty remarkable. Some of that was paid in his role as a collaborator to the National Park Service, sort of a paid advisor anytime they had a kind of, planning, acquisition, tricky issue with concessions, that sort of thing. Olmsted was there to be a sounding board to the senior staff. And then jump in on occasion, utilizing the resources of the firm to solve a little design problem. And they did, in fact, complete a few design projects, some of which are well known, such as the Rockefeller Memorial at the Great Smokies, or the Motor Road at Acadia National Park. But Olmsted Jr. also played a really important role in helping the National Park Service define what future land should become part of the National Park Service. So his advocacy role and his work with many people that he knew in other professional organizations was really important to a young federal agency. And in particular, the one we think of the most, of course, is the Everglades, and the big trip that Olmsted Jr. took with many others as a reconnaissance to justify why this really unique and important ecosystem should be part of the National Park Service. So it's really quite an interesting legacy that involved planning, design, acquisition, and design for historic places, in fact, that later became parts of the National Park Service, particularly in Washington, D.C. It was a great pleasure to be a part of.
Thank you both. Dr. Lowe, Lauren and Rolf's work, along with, and they mentioned Ethan Carr,
Yes.
aim to create a more complex and inclusive storytelling of the National Park Service origin. As the nation's largest education institution, the self-reflection allows us to be more relatable and a trusted resource.
Mhm.
How do you see this aligning with NPS goals of relevancy and stewardship in the future?
Well, I first of all, thank you. I read the historic resource study and I enjoyed it. It's one of my favorites that has been produced. Not only for Jay's question of really exploring an unexplored aspect of the National Park Service origin. It causes us, as part of the centennial of the National Park Service, to examine ourselves in terms of the accuracy of the stories that we tell, the multiple perspectives and groups and communities that have been engaged in the National Park project, right? This American ideal, or best idea, as it's been characterized, and tell the multiplicity of those stories, right? It also illuminated how there were contestations over what landscape architecture is and how it would play out in our national parks, right? I remember one portion of the HRS, the Historic Resource Study, talking about Olmsted Jr.'s deep protest of a reconstruction, right? And we grappled with that in the National Park Service in the past, and he was having these intellectual discussions and debates about that before the National Park Service dealt with that as one of the models of preservation. Would we pursue that or not pursue that? So it very much lends itself to this self-examination that helps us to make better decisions, right? We can identify the fault lines and potential barriers and pitfalls if we are able to honestly self-examine, if we examine our myths of, you know, our great park leaders and who has contributed to the creation of the national park idea. And it also speaks to expansion of stewardship, right? Of who has responsibility for stewardship, whose ideas, what methods are those that are appropriate and valid for us to explore in the preservation and conservation of our resources, both cultural and natural. And so if we don't understand what has happened in the past, what the impacts and legacies of those events or discussions or debates are, how can we manage the resources that we care for now? I always say that history hasn't stopped. It isn't going to stop. And so we are still waiting for the next new park unit. And studying this history, as was done by Rolf and Lauren through the HRS, I think clearly gives us some case studies for how we be inclusive, how we invite collaboration and co-stewardship of our resources. I want to point out that something that is very unique about the Olmsted legislation is the directive to have cooperative agreements, right? Looking forward to what is currently a National Park Service model of having partnership parks or co-stewarded parks with community members, with indigenous communities, tribes, traditionally associated peoples that have a deep cultural and spiritual and sacred connection to our public lands, right? And I think the work that we do has been done on the resource study itself, gives us a greater model about how to do that now and in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. So we have, looks like we have some questions coming in from the crowd, and I'll start going through those. Lori Matthews, who once worked for Fairsted as a historical landscape architect with the NPS. You've talked about how the early work at Fairsted holds so many groundbreaking moments in the NPS and the treatment of cultural landscapes. How is it, or might it be, that nexus of innovation into the future? And I'll open that to all.
Well, I can speak a little bit about in my role as Deputy Federal Preservation Officer. I currently see all National Register nominations that are developed for for National Park Service owned properties, and I will say our further analysis and evaluation of what is historic, what is culturally significant, is being looked at through a lens of cultural landscape level significance. And it very much emerges from an Olmsted concept of what the scenic landscape is and how it contributes to significance, to history, to resource preservation. So practically, it's affecting how we go about our legislative work of what is eligible, determined eligible for the National Register, what is the integrity of the site, and how we maintain this site in the future.
Ralph or Lauren?
Well, Lauren, you should speak as from the perspective of Friends of Fairsted. You wear so many hats, it's hard to count them.
Well, I think that when we did the work at Fairsted, it was a great example of many hands make light work. Right, because we had this incredible collaboration of partners with particular expertise that came together to really create a highly accurate uh, preservation project and get it done and get it well cared for. And I think that is, speaking to the future, it's a great example of what it takes a village sometimes to care for these really important historic landscapes. From the Friends of Fairsted perspective, Friends of Fairsted is the philanthropic partner of the National Park Service at Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site. And we help to support the park in their continued efforts to do this great work, whether it's continuing to support the archives, the Good Neighbors education program, the stewardship of buildings and grounds, and of course, perhaps most importantly, public programs that help communicate the important value of the Olmsted legacy across the country.
I might just add that the one thing that this was done at Fairsted is it was an example of how you take a national park and make it useful to society beyond a place to visit and stretch it in many different directions to provide connections, to provide context, but also to be useful. And that continues today with the outreach to horticulturalists and teaching young people skills, but also being a partner in the revitalization of some of the most important urban landscapes in America. I mean, talk about utility and relevancy. I think that's an inspiration that all parks should reach for in some manner if they can.
Mhm.
I don't think we would have had a Olmsted bicentennial if we didn't have this wealth of records available at Fairsted, so that municipal, state, and regional land stewards could properly care for their Olmsted landscapes.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. I have another question here from Alan Oberst. He asks, here in Buffalo, we often find decision makers, planners, and sometimes even park advocates don't recognize the essential role of cultural landscape reports. Given the historic role of MPS and Fairsted in developing standards for CLRs and providing essential archival material for CLRs, could MPS and Fairsted be doing more evangelism for CLRs?
Boy, that's a great question.
It's a great question. I open it up to all. I don't know if I'm going to answer that one, but Lauren or Dr. Lowe?
I'll jump in on that one. I'm not a National Park Service employee now, but I've sat on both sides of the fence because I've been a consultant, working on Olmsted projects and been at Fairsted. I think it is a challenge when monies are tight. It's really, really hard sometimes for folks to justify the expense for research and analysis. And the Park Service always was really good about making sure they had a set aside, project was funded at a certain level, a portion of that had to be, needed to be spent on all of the planning and study that needed to make sure that the ultimate project, did a good job. So I'm not sure if that sort of directive at a policy level, trickles down to all state and municipal governments, but it should. Because you can't really meet the Secretary's standards. You can't do a good job of stewardship if you don't know what you should be taking care of.
That's right. Dr. Lowe, you have any thoughts?
So I'm going to make a general comment to direct questions of that nature to what we call our community assistance program, particularly our technical preservation services program, which does provide guidance on how to do these certain surveys, inventories, and evaluations for cultural landscapes, for historic architecture. I would just echo Lauren's comments generally about capacity and the need for prioritization in terms of what the National Park Service can and can't reasonably do. But that is something that we're aware of. That's something that we would like to provide through our community assistance programs and through our partnerships, like the one we do have with Olmsted Network. But for us right now, a lot of the ability to do things of that nature come down to capacity.
Dr. Lowe, thank you. We're coming up on time here. I think we could probably have another 2 to 3 hours of conversation with all the different aspects of the site. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank everybody there, and thank everybody who made the call today and the great questions. So, Dee Dee, I'm going to give it back to you.
So much, Jay. It has just been a fascinating conversation to hear about the history and the future of this great historic site and how the National Park Service plans, I think, has been very valuable for all of us. Obviously, we believe that more cultural landscape reports will be a marvelous thing to see, because I think in the end, when these places have these reports, it helps them to do their work more efficiently and more cost effectively. So we certainly encourage more of those studies in the future. But I just want to say thank you again to all of you for a terrific conversation. We have recorded it today, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel shortly, so you can watch it again and again and again and make certain you pick up all the great pieces of information we've learned. I also want to bring to your attention our next webinar, which will look at Olmsted and campus design. This will be on May 21, and the program is called Mental Health, Nature, and the Campus Experience. We'll be looking at Olmsted landscapes at Stanford and Troy universities. We'll be exploring the Nature RX program, which applies Olmsted's understanding of the importance of contact to nature on our college campuses, and also examine how Olmsted is inspiring campus design at other universities such as Georgia Tech. And of course, we are here today because we are looking forward to the birthday tomorrow. So I want to encourage everyone, don't forget to raise a glass to Mr. Olmsted. You can start today. You can continue throughout his birthday. We hope you will celebrate his 202nd birthday by making a donation to the Olmsted Network so that we can continue to champion his irreplaceable parks and landscapes around the country. So I want to say thanks to all of you who attended, and happy birthday, Fred.